How's it going guys, Chris here, and in this guide we're going to be checking out all the different Galactic Empire enemy types and bosses you can expect to see over the course of Star Wars Jedi Survivor. Basically the Imperial enemies, conquering and oppressing the galaxy while trying to hunt you down over the course of the game. So, with Stormtroopers being the standard foot soldiers of the Imperial army, it's no surprise to see them scattered around all over Jedi Survivor, policing the planets and giving their inhabitants a bit of a headache. The Empire's military presence across the galaxy is mainly due to these guys being stationed everywhere, and although they might seem threatening to most normal life forms, they're not going to be able to boss around a fully fledged Jedi, with those E11 blaster bolts being easy to block and return to sender. Unlike in the movies though, these Stormtroopers must have had a bit of target practice before getting sent out on the field, being surprisingly accurate and able to get quite a lot of their shots to actually go towards their target. Being armed with a blaster obviously makes them a ranged threat, more effective in numbers when there's a whole squad firing at you, having multiple enemies to deal with at once. Nevertheless, despite often travelling in group formations, Stormtroopers are the cannon fodder of the Imperial army, completely defenseless to your lightsaber attacks or blaster shots, highly vulnerable to your Force abilities and Jedi mind tricks, while also being their own worst enemies too, with their own blaster shots being easily reflected right back at them. Let's just say these guys don't exactly have it very easy. The leaders of Stormtrooper battalions are the Stormtrooper Commanders, wearing those orange shoulder plates to signify their higher role. The Commander variants act a little bit like the standard ones, only being slightly tougher, also able to give out orders to the standard Stormtroopers, directing them when to open fire for better effectiveness. Commanders are also equipped with detonators, which you'll need to avoid to prevent getting blown up, but can simply be avoided or pushed back towards the commander who threw it, so just by having that extra superiority, it's probably not going to help them survive when you decide to turn up. Another basic enemy of the Galactic Empire is the Scout Trooper, a melee-based variant armed with an electro baton, which often work alongside Stormtroopers to assist with those close-ranged engagements. Scout Troopers have lighter armour to grant them better mobility, and they've been trained to try and bash you over the head using offensive tactics, rushing forwards together in an attempt to try and overwhelm you up close. They might have the balls to take on a force-using lightsaber-wielding Jedi in hand-to-hand combat, but they usually won't have the skill or strength to match, losing most of the fights they start, especially when they're taking you on by themselves. Their stamina is quickly depleted, despite being able to block off some of your lightsaber strikes, and they can be hacked to bits in just a few quick swipes, making them wish they would have ran the other way instead. In larger groups, however, Scout Troopers can pose more of a threat, all diving in, swinging those electric sticks around, making it trickier to keep tabs on who's going to throw a jab next. Alongside the standard Scout Troopers, you've also got the Commander variants, just like with the Stormtroopers. Slightly tougher opponents, able to block more of your attacks, also having the ability to throw a few curveballs into the mix by using unblockable spin techniques that you'll need to dodge out of the way of, often catching you out in the middle of a fight. Think of the Commanders as deadlier, better trained versions of their weaker counterparts, being noticeably more effective in close range fights, especially when they gang up on you with other Imperial enemies. Probe droids are back, hovering around gathering intel on the environment, and despite being designed to collect data, much like everything else Imperial, they're also armed with their own weapons, being capable of shooting lasers at you over distance. Attacking with lethal force isn't exactly this droid's forte, with those weapons mainly just being there for defensive purposes, and to try and fend off anyone who might want to capture it to extract that gathered intelligence. And much like with typical blaster fire, you can reflect those bolts back to deal damage. But it's best knowing that any damage dealt to the probe droid is going to initiate its self-destruct protocol, forcing it to drop down and explode not long after, to avoid compromising its collected data. This is obviously bad news for you if you happen to be close by, with the droid having the tendency to try and take you down with it, even floating towards you, so that you're inside the blast radius when it pops off. Crafty little buggers. Probe droids can still be dealt with fine enough though, being something that you can weaponize yourself, throwing them at other nearby enemies using the Force, or by hacking them using BD's slice ability. Along your journey, you'll often bump into KX series security droids, which are there to assist Imperial troops, escort and protect high-ranking officers, or just generally push people around and be a bit of a douche. Despite having limbs that look like they should be sliced off easily with a simple lightsaber strike, security droids are pretty strong and durable. They're very impressive, and they're not going to take any crap from anyone, even a Jedi, using brute force to try and get the better of you. Just like in the first game, they'll slap you in the face, throw punches and jabs, and generally swing their arms around to knock you all over the place. Most of these attacks can be blocked and parried, though some of them can't, forcing you to be vigilant. especially when they're about to pick you up and slam you into the floor, and probably throw you back out. The slower movements can be easier to read, but that extra power can help to make up for that, having a decent amount of health and heavier attacks than some of the other enemies, while being effective at fighting in both groups or single-handedly, even known to whip out a pocket blaster if you're just out of their punching range. The first main boss battle occurs when you encounter the Ninth Sister again, who's back for a bit of revenge after you whooped her ass in the first game, right the way back on Kashyyyk. Being an Inquisitor trained to hunt down remaining Jedi after Order 66, you can expect the Ninth Sister to put up a decent fight, being fueled by rage and enhanced by mechanical parts. She's armed with a double-bladed lightsaber, used to strike up close, but can also be thrown over distance to hit you over range. And being a former Jedi herself, she's not going to shy away from using those Force abilities against you either, countering your attacks and limiting your movements during the fight. You're going to have to keep parrying the Ninth Sister's lightsaber strikes to whittle down her stamina, allowing you to charge in and land a few hits, all while jumping out of the way of those unblockable attacks in between, which can potentially knock out huge chunks of health. She's going to use a pretty wide variety of different strikes, which will all need to be blocked, parried or dodged to avoid taking damage. Though when you've dealt enough yourself, you'll eventually split your double-bladed lightsaber in two, giving you access to the dual-wield stance. After depleting the rest of the Ninth Sister's health, you'll be able to use a special parry attack to chip away the last bit and finish her off once and for all. Well, after trying to convince her to switch back to the good side, that is. Instead of wielding standard blaster rifles, the heavy assault troopers carry the big guns. The Z6 rotary blaster cannon capable of shredding up its targets in a hailstorm of shots. These troopers have the job of laying down suppressive fire while they defend from stationary positions, having low mobility, but tons of firepower as a trade-off. The cannon might be able to fire lots of shots off really quickly, while being able to block off incoming fire with its energy shield at the front, but it does have its downsides, with those blaster bolts being able to send flying back to the heavy trooper, only to rip through that shield and take them out. Obviously, these guys can become more of a problem in hectic fights with multiple enemies, with the heavy troopers being powerful enemies that you'll probably want to prioritise killing earlier rather than later. Their barrages of shots have cooldown periods, giving you opportunities to gain some ground and strike up close. Or you could always just use their own power against them by refracting those bolts back, which is especially effective with the double-bladed lightsaber. As for the shield troopers, these enemies do exactly what you'd expect, carry heavy shields, capable of blocking incoming lightsaber strikes and blaster bolts. These are essentially the riot officers of the game, which acts in a similar way to the scout troopers, only now having that shield, which can be used to hold you back, knock you down, and charge into you to deal some damage. Damaging that shield can sometimes cause the trooper to drop it, allowing you to take them out while they're vulnerable. Or you could always just yank the shield off them using the force, and throw it back at them to knock them over. Failing that, just try and outmaneuver the trooper by flanking their sides, or jumping over their heads, hitting them with your lightsaber when their shield's facing the wrong way. Pretty simple. They're one of the more defensive enemies in the game, able to block off a lot of your attacks, but there's still quite a lot of ways to get past that shield regardless. Turning the heat up a bit, the Flametrooper's armed with a high-powered flamethrower, capable of spitting out plumes of fire over a short distance of around about 10 meters. This gives Imperial forces incendiary support, used to flush out their targets from tight spaces and burn them to a crisp. And unlike traditional blasters, although they have to sacrifice range, they don't need to be very accurate to be effective, covering whole areas in front of the trooper in deadly flames which heat up the floor and make the zone much more hazardous, all while forcing you back and limiting your attacks, with close range combat being much riskier than normal. In confined areas, these flamethrowers can be pretty brutal, giving you little room to escape or counter the trooper's fire streams. You'll have to find paths to outmaneuver them, or wait for their flame rifles to overheat, giving you a brief opportunity to dash in and strike up close while they're vulnerable. Ranged attacks like blaster fire and lightsaber throws are also a pretty good way to deal damage from a safer distance, and of course, you can always use the force to bring them to you for a swift kill. Just don't do it while those flames are flying everywhere. Some of the troopers you'll encounter have been fortunate enough to be given a jetpack to assist patrolling and scouting the area. This lets them pass over awkward terrain and reach high vantage points with ease, and it can also help in combat too, allowing the Jetpack Trooper to hover around, avoid short-range attacks, and dodge incoming fire. They can only fly in short bursts, so you'll have to strike quickly while they're grounded, or you'll have to use ranged attacks like your blaster or lightsaber throws to deal with them as they shoot off into the air. These guys have specialised training and equipment to give them an advantage over the standard troopers, armed with normal blasters, but also given access to grenades, which can be thrown down at you from the air to get a more accurate trajectory. These grenades can be used against the Jetpack Troopers by lobbing them back, of course, which is probably one of the most effective ways to take them out, especially with them being so mobile and resistant to your force pull and push abilities. Another type of trooper in the game are the ones wielding rocket launchers, mainly there as an anti-armor role for destroying vehicles, but also pretty effective at blasting you away from a distance, with those rockets having high splash damage as they hit the ground. Rocket launcher troopers are a bit of a nuisance that can attack you over long ranges with good results, forcing you to jump out of the way of those incoming projectiles as they come flying in your direction. The explosions are pretty beefy, and can potentially dish out nasty amounts of damage if you don't get out of the way in time. And in a fight against multiple enemies at once, this can make the rocket trooper a really deadly ranged target that's generally best dealing with as fast as possible. You're best throwing those rockets back to take them out quickly, timing your force grab and throw abilities just before the rocket hits you. Not always the easiest thing to do when there's a lot to focus on at once, but probably the most effective way to kill them without using your blaster. They can't move around due to the launcher's heavy weight, so they're essentially a sitting duck to your attacks. And with them having to reload the launcher after every shot, this gives you a nice opportunity to strike with other weapons. As well as the standard security droids, you'll also be met with the Enforcer variants too, slightly tougher and more resilient to your attacks, armed with a stun baton to whack you in the face with. These KX series droids are actually designed to train scout troopers to wield their electro batons. You know, the guys you've been slicing your way through since the start of the game. And this gives these droids a similar fighting style, only with them being the teachers, and devoid of human error, they're going to be much better at getting the job done, having mastered that fighting style, with the little help of mechanical engineering of course. You can easily distinguish these guys from their basic counterparts, due to that lighter paint job, and that big power pack jutting out from their backs. And being variants of the KX series droids, you can expect them to move around in a similar way, only now lunging at you with that weapon instead of swinging their arms around. Essentially acting like more powerful robotic scout troopers, they can block or parry quite a few of your attacks, forcing you to treat them with a tad more respect, before rushing in and swinging that lightsaber around like a madman. Though you can also block a lot of their attacks, creating a nice window of opportunity to jump in and deal chunks of damage to them too. Stomping around like a giant clumsy metal chicken, the AT-ST returns to the series to try and take you out with lots of firepower and heavy weapons. These are the armoured recon vehicles the Imperials travel around in to scout out areas and eliminate small threats. And because there's no Ewoks around to take them on this time, you're going to have to get the job done yourself, all while trying to avoid everything they throw at you in the process. Being armed with blaster cannons and missile launchers makes the AT-ST a pretty deadly thing over range, while having the ability to drop electrical grenades nearby also gives the vehicle more defensive attacks for when you get a bit too close, meaning you'll have to be on your toes and ready to dive out of the way of whatever the hell gets thrown at you next. It's typically best to use its own attacks against them, reflecting those blaster bolts and force pushing its missiles and grenades back towards the AT-ST, all of which is going to help to chip away at the machine's health. Though it's also going to be highly vulnerable to your lightsaber strikes and blaster shots too, whether that be from attacks over range or up close striking the walker's vulnerable legs. Once you've whittled down the AT-ST's health, it'll fall to the ground and the Imperial officer piloting it is going to plop out of the hatch on the roof. Then you finish them off in whichever way you fancy. A special variant of Imperial soldier comes in the form of the Purge Trooper, part of the Inquisitorius program, formed to hunt down surviving Jedi, such as yourself. Armed with more advanced weapons and armour than your typical foot soldier, these guys have had extra training and are much more skilled in combat. Not quite as much as the Inquisitors themselves, but still better than a lot of the other enemies you'll face throughout your journey. Some of them prefer to use speed to their advantage by wielding twin electro batons, lightweight weapons designed to overcome opponents using agility, overwhelming targets with flurries of quick strikes and lunges, which are generally best dodged or parried if you can time it right. Other Purge Troopers use the electro staff instead, another melee weapon, but one which is better at countering your lightsaber strikes and defending against oncoming damage, while being able to deal plenty of damage too, using combo attacks and unblockable heavy swings. The last Purge Trooper variant is the Commander, one which prefers to attack using a blaster over range, attacking with rapid fire shots, high powered charge up shots, stun grenades, and of course, slapping you around with the butt of the gun, while rolling out of the way your lightsaber lunges. All of these Purge Trooper variants can be pretty dangerous, especially when working together to use those different combat techniques against you at once, so you'll have to be on your guard and adjust your playstyle depending on which type you're taking on at the time. One of the most badass Imperial enemy types you'll come across in the game is the DT Sentry Droid. Elite guards for the Galactic Empire which use a diverse set of different attacks and combat strategies to try and get the better of you. These bulky droids are going to tower over everyone around, whack you all over the place with those powerful hydraulic arms, while altering their weapon configurations to suit the task at hand. This means that not every fight is going to play out the same, with different sentry droids being armed with different things, using a pretty wide variety of weapons from electro staffs and vibro axes to wrist-mounted blasters and even rocket launchers, giving them lots of different ways to deal heavy damage, whether that be up close or from a distance. Although they might look like walking tanks, parrying their strikes or lunges is going to weaken their arms, letting you chop them off with your lightsaber while they're vulnerable. This stops them from using certain weapons, which might seem like a big advantage, but do be warned, it will make them more aggressive, relying on hard-hitting melee attacks to try their best to survive at all costs. You'll actually be able to find a legendary variant of the DT Sentry Droid back on the planet of Coruscant, hidden away behind a secret door. This guy is called DL1T, who's been given a black and grey paint job and is armed with both the electro staff and the vibro axe. Other than that though, he fights just like the others, using melee attacks and spiraling spins to try and knock you down and smack you around. Definitely worth taking him down though, as you'll be able to unlock the ability to hack other DT droids to fight on your side, which can be a huge help in certain battles, with these droids being just so bloody powerful. Coming from one of the deadliest opponents in the game, the ISB Agent is pretty much the complete opposite. A bit of a noob in combat situations who's even more useless at fighting than the bog standard Stormtroopers. Of course, it's not exactly these guys' jobs to hunt down and kill anyone, especially Jedi, with them just being officers working for the Imperial Security Bureau, a law enforcement and intelligence agency of the Galactic Empire, so don't expect them to pull any wild moves or do anything particularly threatening. They might be armed with a blaster, but they're not very good at using it, being about as accurate as a toddler with a spud gun. Shots can be reflected back at the ISB Agent without any real effort needed, and because they don't have any kind of protective armour, this also makes them very weak to practically all of your attacks, with even the smallest amount of damage usually putting them out of action. I guess if there's a few around working with other Imperial enemies, then the extra blaster shots coming your way will be another thing to avoid in that fight. But in general, you can have a bit of fun being evil against these agents, with them being massively underpowered and unprepared to take you on. Along with the basic probe droids that scour the lands and collect intelligence, there's also a more combat-ready variant called the Viper Probe Droid, which is basically tasked with the same job as the other, only now being much more geared up to defend itself, having a much faster fire rate, unblockable charge-up shots, a reinforced outer casing capable of withstanding more damage, a concussion grenade launcher, and generally much more aggressive programming, making them a far bigger threat, especially in numbers. Viper droids are not only deadlier than their counterparts, but they're also a lot more agile too, strafing from side to side and moving around to try and dodge your attacks and make themselves a lot trickier to keep an eye on as they constantly switch positions, though your force powers can be used to halt their movements and draw them closer within lightsaber range. They might be more mobile than the standard variants, but at least they don't self-destruct after taking damage, and most of those shots and grenades fired at you can of course be sent back to the droid to chip away at its health. Just be aware of your stamina when fighting these guys, as all those rapid fire shots that you'll need to block will quickly deplete it, leaving you very vulnerable if you're not careful. So after making an appearance in the first game, Vader's back for his big encore. And while you won't actually get to fight him as the game's main protagonist, Cal, you will be given control of Seer instead, who is much more evenly matched with Vader when it comes to their overall power and skill. You'll come face to face with the Dark Lord himself during the evacuation of the Archive on Jeddah, putting you in an epic fight which spans over 3 phases. You're going to have to put your skill to the test in this one, with the fight getting increasingly harder as it rolls on through the phases. Though the first one shouldn't pose too much of a problem, with it mainly consisting of simple lightsaber strikes and blocks. Keep parrying his attacks and whittling down his stamina, letting you rush in with a flurry of strikes while he's vulnerable. Just beware of the dreaded grab move he does, which is unblockable, as it's going to deal tons of damage, potentially killing you, even if you've got a fair bit of health left in the tank. Phase 2 is pretty similar to the first one, only with Vader now being a bit more pissed off and eager to attack more ferociously. Just keep on blocking and parrying his lunges, watch out for that grab of doom, and aware of him lobbing that lightsaber to hit you over range, and ready for him to use the force against you to draw you in closer. Force powers against him are practically useless, so you're best sticking with aggressive lightsaber combos and counters, while staying vigilant for his unblockable strikes thrown in between. Though pretty much any hit you take can have devastating effects on your health, so just try not to get too ballsy. Phase 3 is where things start to heat up, as the room ignites into a raging inferno. The duel becomes even more intense, with more unblockable attacks and heavy strikes being thrown into the mix that will need to be dodged, with Vader also choosing to throw chunks of debris at you, sometimes able to kill you instantly. You'll have to use the Force Barrier ability to block these attacks, though it can sometimes be best just to play more aggressively instead to prevent him from doing so. Offensive tactics are generally best used in this fight throughout, and after whittling down enough of Vader's health, the fight's going to end, and the story will continue. So those are all the Galactic Empire enemy types and bosses you're going to encounter over the course of Star Wars Jedi Survivor. Do keep an eye out for other guides covering the creatures, Bedlam Raiders, and the Haxian Brood enemies on my channel, and subscribe to stay updated with all that new content and much more coming up very soon. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll be seeing you in that next one.